Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville was born around 1437. I say around because there is no record of her birth. It's just an educated guess. This would have been similar to her father, Sir Richard Woodville's upbringing, but her mother had grown up the daughter of a count, and then become a royal duchess after her first marriage. So, not being noble was new to her, but I think she was in love. She had followed in the steps of her sister-in-law, Catherine of Valois, who did a very similar thing, and is a whole nother episode. Her parents broke the law to get married. They were fined £1,000, but this fine was pardoned around the time and maybe because of Elizabeth's birth. She was the oldest of the couple's 14 children. In 1448, when Elizabeth was 11 years old, her father was made a baron. This raised the family from gentry to noble. By this time, her siblings included Louis X, Anne 9, Anthony 6, Mary 5, John 3, and Lionel 1. So they had 7 children in 11 years. They added Martha and Joan by 1452, and at this point Elizabeth was 15 and getting married herself. She was marrying 20-year-old John Grey, a future baron. She would have assumed at this point that the rest of her life was going to be just the same as her first 15 years had gone. The difference was that she was no longer going to be the daughter of a baron, she would be the wife of a baron. She was described as the most beautiful woman in the island of Britain, with heavy-lidded eyes like those of a dragon. It sounds like she was, at least at the time, considered very, very pretty. 3 years later, they had their first son, and named him Thomas. The same year Thomas was born, the English Civil War, the Wars of the Roses, broke out, or it was called at the time the Cousins' War, because it was a royal family feud. Elizabeth and her husband were supporters of the king and the Lancastrians against the Yorkists. Thomas was followed 2 years later by his little brother Richard. Richard was named after his grandfather. When Thomas was 6 and Richard was 4, their father was killed while fighting for the Lancastrians. This left Elizabeth, a 24-year-old single mother of 2 little boys. To make matters worse, her husband died fighting for the losing side. That wasn't a great position to be in. Since he had died a traitor, his inheritance had been confiscated, and Elizabeth would have had no other choice than to move back in with her parents until they could get things worked out. The story I've heard the most was that Elizabeth went to where she knew the king was passing by. The king passed by and thought she was so beautiful and fell in love. Then Elizabeth pulled an Anne Boleyn, or I guess Anne Boleyn pulled an Elizabeth Woodville. Anne wouldn't be born for another 35 years at least. Elizabeth refused to sleep with the king. He got all mad, but he was in love, so they got secretly married. The only people in attendance were her mother and 2 of her ladies. But the new King Edward had a reputation for being quite promiscuous. He was kind of sleeping his way through his kingdom. Most of this is actually verifiable. That is probably what pretty much happened. And just like that, a Lancastrian woman whose first husband died fighting against King Edward was the true love of the very same King Edward. All I can say is that King Edward was described as handsome, 6'4", which was incredibly tall. I mean, even now it's tall. Then it was incredibly tall. Or 193 centimeters, if that makes more sense. He was an impressive sight in armor, and took care to wear splendid clothes. This was also done deliberately, to contrast him with King Henry VI, whose physical and mental frailties undermined his position. So he was playing the cool, good-looking guy, because the other guy wasn't that. The marriage stayed secret. Edward didn't want it out until he was securely seated on the throne. His new wife was barely more than common. She was also 5 years older than him, and not a virgin. She had 2 sons already. The goal for his advisors would have been to secure a marriage with a French princess that came with an alliance. In 1461, Edward won a hard-fought battle at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. The battle was preceded by a meteorological phenomenon known as a parhelion, or 3 suns. 3 suns in the sky really freaked people out. They didn't realize that it was just a weather phenomenon. Edward was able to convince his troops that it was a message from God, that they were going to win. And they did. However, this was offset by Warwick's defeat at the Second Battle of St. Albans on the 17th of February. The Lancastrians regained custody of Henry VI. The two met in London, where Edward was hastily crowned king, before marching north, where the two sides met at the Battle of Towton, fighting in the middle of a snowstorm. This was the bloodiest battle to ever take place on English soil. Margaret fled to Scotland with Prince Edward, while the new king returned to London for his coronation. Henry VI remained at large for over a year, but was caught and imprisoned in the Tower of London. There was little point in killing him. His son remained alive. Since this would have just transferred the Lancastrian claim from a frail captive to one who was young and free, they figured it would be better instead to keep him alive and deposed. The king is in prison. Long live the king? King Edward allowed Warwick, the kingmaker, to negotiate a treaty with France, which included a suggested marriage between Edward and Anne of France, or Bona of Savoy, respectively the daughter and sister-in-law of the French king. But Edward was already secretly married, so he had to make a choice. In October 1464, Warwick was enraged to discover that on the 1st of May, Edward had secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow with 2 sons, whose Lancastrian husband, John Grey, died at the Second Battle of St. Albans, fighting against Warwick himself. If nothing else, it was a clear demonstration that he was not in control of the king, despite suggestions to the contrary. Edward's motives have been widely discussed by contemporaries and historians alike. Although Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, came from the upper nobility, her father, Richard Woodville, was a middle-ranking provincial knight. The Privy Council told Edward, with unusual frankness, that she was no wife for a prince such as himself, for she was not the daughter of a duke or an earl. The marriage was certainly unwise and unusual, although not unheard of. Henry VI's mother, Catherine of Valois, married her chamberlain, Owen Tudor. By all accounts, Elizabeth possessed considerable charm of person and intellect, while Edward was used to getting what he wanted and rarely told no. Historians generally accept the marriage was an impulsive decision, but differ on whether it was a calculated political move. One view is that the low status of the Woodvilles was part of the attraction, since unlike the Nevilles, they were reliant on Edward and thus more likely to remain loyal. Others argue, if this was his purpose, there were far better options available. All agree it had significant political implications that impacted the rest of Edward's reign. One reason for this was that 12 of the new queen's siblings survived into adulthood, creating a large pool of competitors for offices and estates, as well as in the matrimony market. Resentment built when her sisters made a series of advantageous unions. Jacquetta and maybe her daughter went to matchmaking for the large family, and Elizabeth Woodville was crowned queen on the 26th of May, 1465. In the early years of his reign, Edward IV's governance of England was dependent upon a small circle of supporters, most notably his cousin, Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick. Warwick was both embarrassed and offended by his cousin's secret marriage to Elizabeth. His relationship with Edward IV was ruined. Their first daughter together was Elizabeth of York, born in 1466, when Elizabeth was 29 and Edward was 24. Her christening was celebrated at Westminster Abbey. The following year, the couple had a second baby, Mary, and in 1469, Cecily was born. The birth of Cecily, the third daughter in a row, was a great disappointment for King Edward IV. For the first time, he suggested that he would not have sons and that the crown could pass to his eldest daughter, Elizabeth. While officially legal, this wasn't something England had been willing to do in the past. Warwick responded by building an alliance with Edward's disaffected younger brother and heir, the Duke of Clarence, who held estates adjacent to Neville in the north. Concerned by this, Edward blocked a proposed marriage between Clarence and Warwick's eldest daughter, Isabel. The king was worried that Warwick's money in George's hands would be problematic. In early July, Clarence defied his brother by traveling to Calais, where he married Isabel in a ceremony conducted by George Neville and overseen by Warwick. Isabel was just a pawn in a political alliance. Elizabeth's status as a commoner before her sudden secret marriage to Edward was primarily the reason for the backlash against her queenship. She was often seen as arrogant and disrespectful for actions that would be seen as normal by a lady of higher rank, such as her predecessor, Margaret of Anjou. Such was Elizabeth's unpopularity that George, Duke of Clarence, rebellious brother of her husband, later even accused her of witchcraft in order to murder his wife, Isabel Neville. Most historians now believe that Isabel died either of consumption, which we call tuberculosis, or childbed fever. When Elizabeth Woodville's relatives, especially her brother Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, began to challenge Warwick's preeminence in English political society, Warwick conspired with his son-in-law George, Duke of Clarence, the king's younger brother. One of his followers accused Elizabeth Woodville's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, of practicing witchcraft. We cover that in Jacquetta's episode. King Edward was held in Middleham Castle by Warwick on the 12th of August. His father-in-law, Richard Woodville, and Richard's younger son, John Woodville, were executed. However, it soon became clear that there was little support for Warwick or Clarence. Edward was released in September, with their rebellion defeated. The two fled to France in May 1470, taking with them a pregnant Isabel, who lost her baby on the boat trip across the Channel. Seeing an opportunity, Louis XI persuaded Warwick to negotiate with his longtime enemy, Margaret of Anjou. She eventually agreed, first making him kneel before her in silence for 15 minutes. She was mad. If you don't remember why, go back and listen to the Margaret of Anjou episode. With French support, Warwick landed in England and announced his intention to restore King Henry to the throne. By now, the Yorkist regime was deeply unpopular, and the Lancastrians rapidly assembled an army of over 30,000. Edward narrowly escaped capture and was forced to seek refuge in Flanders. Having received news of her husband's fall, Queen Elizabeth, along with her mother and 3 daughters, hurriedly left the Tower in the middle of the night on a barge and arrived in search of refuge at Westminster Abbey, where she was known as a very pious woman. When the royal family arrived at the hideout, the abbey was nearly empty. The abbot of Westminster, Thomas Milling, took them under his protection. A kind, hospitable man, he did not want to place the queen and princesses with the criminals, and gave them his house at the western entrance of the abbey, where there were 3 rooms and everything necessary for the convenience of the royal family. Queen Elizabeth gave birth to her first son Edward while in sanctuary. She named him Edward after his father, the king. While in hiding, the princesses spent most of their time with their nannies, as Queen Elizabeth was busy with the birth and subsequent care of Prince Edward, something she was not used to. As queen, her babies had gone straight to the wet nurse. Backed by wealthy Flemish merchants, in March 1471, Edward returned to England, close to his estates in Yorkshire. Supporters were initially reluctant to commit. The key northern city of York, of whom his father and himself had been duke, opened their gates when he claimed to only be seeking the return of his dukedom, like Henry IV 70 years earlier. But like Henry, he soon had the popularity to reclaim the throne. In April 1471, Edward IV returned to London, and the first thing he did, after attending a Thanksgiving service at Westminster Abbey, was to retrieve his family from sanctuary and meet his new son. In May, Edward IV finally defeated the Lancastrian troops at the Battle of Tewkesbury, in which the Lancastrian heir, Prince Edward, was killed, and his mother, Margaret of Anjou, was captured. The Lancastrians organized an attack on the tower, intending to restore Henry VI to the throne. 2 towers, one of which the royal family were sheltering in, were fired on from the river. The attack was repulsed, but after this, the king may have decided to put his predecessor to death. And on the 21st of May, 1471, King Henry died of melancholia, but more likely he was strangled or smothered in his sleep. The Queen then had Margaret in 1472, but Margaret only lived 8 months. Then she had her second son with Edward in 73. They named him Richard, probably after the king's youngest brother, because if you remember, Elizabeth also had a son from her first marriage named Richard, probably after her father. So she now had 4 sons. 2 of them were named Richard. The last significant rebellion ended in 1474, when George, Duke of Clarence, was wildly suspected of involvement. Their relationship was not in a good state. Isabel's sister Anne had been put into George's custody after her husband, Prince Edward, was killed. After marrying Margaret of Anjou's son, he died, and she couldn't be trusted as the one-time wife of a traitor. And George had no interest in remarrying her, because then he would have to share his wife's inheritance with the spouse of his sister-in-law. He was using the age-old recipe of controlling the only 2 daughters of a very rich man in order to become a very rich man himself. His brother, Prince Richard, wasn't having it, and he managed to gain control of Anne Neville, the youngest daughter of the kingmaker, and marry her. So Richard Neville's only 2 daughters were married to the king's only 2 brothers. The Yorks had beaten the Lancastrians, but now they were turning on each other. Now the king had his heir, Prince Edward, and his spare, Prince Richard. They were followed by Princess Anne and then George in 77, probably named after his uncle in a kind of peace offering. The 3 sons of Edward and Elizabeth were named Edward, Richard, and George, just like the king and his surviving brothers were Edward, George, and Richard. The king's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, was still unhappy with his brother, the king, and mostly his sister-in-law, the queen. He accused her of witchcraft. He was the father of 3-year-old Margaret and 1-year-old Edward when his wife died just after childbirth, and her baby followed just a couple of months later. She likely died of childbed fever, maybe consumption, or as we call it, tuberculosis, but George thought the queen had killed her with witchcraft. George was eventually executed. He never made amends with his brother, the king. His execution may have been him being drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. This may have also just been a bad joke made by his brother, the king, but that is said to be the way he died. It was his favorite wine. The year after George's death, his nephew and namesake also died at the age of 2, likely of the bubonic plague. That same year, the royal couple had another baby and named her Princess Catherine, and the next year they added Bridget in 80. 1481, Mary died at the age of 14 from an unknown illness, but the plague is always a good guess. The king and queen did seem to use their children to make political alliances, but unlike their predecessors, they seem to have wanted to allow their children to stay in England. They did live away from their parents, as the royal nursery was in another castle, but their daughters were not sent off to other countries to marry foreign men. In 1481, when Cecily reached marriageable age, James III began to insist on her marriage to his son, whom she had been betrothed. An ambassador was sent to England, which was supposed to deliver the princess to Scotland, but Edward IV felt that the Scottish king was only motivated by the desire to obtain the remainder of Cecily's dowry, and the princess's departure was delayed. A year later, the engagement between Cecily's older sister Elizabeth was broken off, and James III decided to follow in the example of his French patron. Edward's health began to fail, and he became subject to an increasing number of ailments. His physicians attributed this, in part, to a habitual use of enemetics, which allowed him to gorge himself at meals and then return after vomiting to start again. Gross. He had a Hunger Games kind of eating disorder, and he was gaining more and more weight. If this reminds you of King Henry VIII, you should know that King Edward was King Henry VIII's maternal grandfather, born to his oldest daughter Elizabeth. Henry VIII, it seems, took after his grandfather Edward. He fell fatally ill at Easter 1483, but survived long enough to add to his will. The most important thing that he added was naming his brother as protector after his death. The cause of Edward's death is uncertain. Allegations of poison were common in an era when lack of medical knowledge meant death often had no obvious explanation. Other suggestions include pneumonia or malaria, although both were well known and easy to describe. One contemporary attributed it to apoplexy brought on by excess, which fits with what is known of his physical habits. King Edward's 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, became King Edward V, and his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed as regent and protector of his nephews. Gloucester took steps to isolate his nephews from their Woodville relations, including their own mother. He intercepted Edward V while the latter was traveling from Ludlow, where he had been living as Prince of Wales, with his uncle Anthony Woodville, to London to be crowned king. Edward V was placed in the royal residence of the Tower of London, ostensibly for his protection, while his uncle Anthony Woodville and his half-brother Richard Grey, who had both been escorting him, were arrested and sent to Pontefract Castle. Elizabeth Woodville fled with her younger son Richard and her daughters, taking sanctuary again at Westminster Abbey, this time not from her husband's brother George, but from her late husband's brother Richard. Gloucester asked Elizabeth to turn over her other son Richard to reside in the Tower and keep his brother Edward company. Elizabeth Woodville, under duress, eventually agreed. 2 months later, Edward IV's marriage was declared invalid. It was claimed that Edward IV had, at the time of his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, already been betrothed to Lady Eleanor Butler. Remember how he was sleeping his way across the country? They claimed he married one of those women. Parliament supported this position. This measure legally bastardized the children of King Edward IV, making them ineligible for the succession, and declared Gloucester the rightful king. Gloucester ascended the throne as Richard III in July 1483, and Edward and Richard disappeared soon afterwards. Rumors began to spread that they had been murdered, and these appear to have been increasingly widely credited, though there were rumors that one or both of them had escaped overseas. The boys were only 10 and 12, so they would have needed a substantial amount of help to escape their uncle, the infamous King Richard III. Edward and his brother Richard were taken to the inner apartments of the Tower, and then were seen less and less, until the end of summer to the autumn of 1483, when they disappeared from public view altogether and were never seen again. Elizabeth Woodville eventually made a deal with her brother-in-law for her and her daughters to leave sanctuary, with her older daughters attending court, and Elizabeth herself retiring to a nunnery. According to only a single, much later Tudor source, Elizabeth's mother made an alliance with Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, who presented himself as the closest claimant to the throne amongst the Lancastrian party. Although Henry Tudor was descended from King Edward III, his claim to the throne was weak, owing to an act of Parliament in the reign of Richard II in the 1390s, which barred accession to the throne to any heirs of the legitimized offspring of Henry's great-great-grandparents John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. Basically, they had been born bastards, but then they were legitimized on the condition that their descendants would never say, "Hey, I want to be the king." But Henry Tudor was saying, "Hey, I want to be the king." Whether such an unprecedented act had force of law is disputed. There was question whether they could say, "Yeah, you're legitimate, but don't be trying to be king." Whatever the merits of Henry's claim, his mother and Elizabeth Woodville agreed that he should move to claim the throne, and once he had, he should marry Elizabeth of York to boost his feeble claim. In December 1483, Henry Tudor swore an oath, promising to marry her, and began planning an invasion. Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York both had claims to the throne, and they were stronger together. Henry Tudor and his army landed in Wales in 1485 and marched inland. On the 22nd of August, Henry Tudor and Richard III met at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard III had a larger army, but was betrayed by some of his most powerful retainers, William Stanley, and died in battle. Henry Tudor took the crown by right of conquest as King Henry VII. Though initially slow to keep his promise, King Henry VII acknowledged the necessity of making Elizabeth of York his wife. But she had been declared illegitimate, along with her other siblings, by her uncle, King Richard III. King Henry had them re-legitimized. Henry also probably wanted to make sure that he was king in his own right before adding his queen to the equation. He didn't want a repeat of the Isabella of France and Edward II fiasco. If you need a refresher, it's in episode 1. They needed a papal dispensation because they were both descended from Edward III. This is what made it work, though. After 32 years of the Lancastrian-York Cousins' War, the House of Lancaster and the House of York were reunited in Henry and Elizabeth's marriage. Elizabeth Woodville died at Bermondsey Abbey on the 8th of June, 1492. With the exception of the Queen, who was awaiting the birth of her 4th child, and Cecily of York, her daughters attended the funeral at Windsor Castle. The surviving accounts of her funeral suggest that at least one source clearly felt that the Queen's funeral should have been more splendid, and may have objected that Henry VII had not been fit to arrange a more queenly funeral for his mother-in-law. Although simplicity was the Queen Dowager's own wish. A letter discovered in 2019, written in 1511, suggests that she had died of plague, which would explain the haste and lack of public ceremony. Elizabeth was survived by her son, Thomas Grey, from her first marriage, now 37. Her daughter, from her second marriage, Elizabeth, now Queen of England, herself 28, and pregnant with her 4th child. And her other daughters, from her second marriage, Cecily, Anne, Catherine, and Bridget. And this is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think of Elizabeth Woodville? She went from the daughter of Gentry all the way up to Queen, then back down to where she started from. Did she have her son Richard sent to his uncle Richard, or did she use a body double and sneak him away? Did she really trust her brother-in-law after both of her younger sons went missing? I can't imagine her trusting them with her daughters after her sons went missing. But it seems she did, maybe feeling she had no other choice. She went through a lot, and I can't even imagine. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.